Bob was in the hospital for 4 days. Not a crisis. I want to say that immediately so you understand the weight of what I am going to tell you correctly. Not a crisis. A warning. The doctors called it. A cardiac episode significant enough to require monitoring and tests and the particular institutional seriousness of a hospital stay. But not. They reassured me repeatedly. Life-threatening. A warning. A message from the body that things needed to change and that the change needed to begin now. I called Christopher from the car park when they admitted Bob. I called him the moment I had a moment to call anyone. After the forms. After the initial assessment. After the nurse with the kind face had shown me to the waiting area and brought me a cup of tea that I held and did not drink. He answered on the second ring. I told him what had happened. I kept my voice steady because Bob needed me to be steady, and I was going to be steady regardless of whatever came next. I said it was not a crisis. I said the doctors were confident. I said I was in the corridor outside cardiology and Bob was being examined and I was all right. Christopher said, "Mum, I'm so glad you called." "How scary," I said. "Will you come?" A pause. Brief. The kind of pause that is not long but is long enough for you to know an answer is being assembled. He said, "I want to, Mum. Things are incredibly busy right now. We've got the Henderson contract closing this week and Diane has her conference." I said, "Yes." "All right," he said, "but let me know if anything changes." "And I'll send flowers," I said. "Thank you, Christopher," he said. "How are you?" I said. "I'm managing," he said. "Good. You're so strong, Mum." "I'll call later." He called later. He sent flowers. They were beautiful flowers. Expensive ones. Arranged with attention. They arrived the next morning at the house where I was not because I was at the hospital. Bob saw them when he came home and said they were lovely. I agreed that they were lovely. I sat in that hospital corridor for 4 days. I ate sandwiches from the machine. I read the same page of my book many times without absorbing it. I watched other families in that corridor. The ones who arrived in numbers and took up the chairs around the walls and brought flasks of tea and rotated in and out of the room as visiting hours allowed. And I thought about 40 years. I thought about every time Christopher had needed someone and I had dropped whatever I was doing and came. The childhood illnesses. The school things. The heartbreak at 22 when the relationship he thought was permanent turned out not to be. And I drove to his flat at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night and sat with him until 3 in the morning. The things he needed me for when he was small and the things he needed me for when he was big and all the times in between when he simply needed the presence of someone who would come. I always came. I sat in the corridor with my undrunk tea and I thought about that. And I thought about the flowers at the house where I was not. And I thought about the Henderson contract and Diane's conference. And I thought about 40 years. And I thought, when did my son become a person who sends flowers? Let me tell you the whole of it. My name is Marion. I am 68 years old. Bob and I have been married for 45 years. which is the kind of number that sounds impossible until you are inside it and realize it is simply the accumulation of days, each one ordinary, most of them good. We had 2 children, Christopher, who is 43, and Elaine, who is 40, and between them in age and between them in temperament. Elaine has always been more like me, direct and undramatic, while Christopher has always had Bob's quality of attentiveness, the quality of someone who notices things that others miss and takes those things seriously. That quality, the attentiveness, is the thing I want to talk about first, because it is the thing that mattered most to me as his mother, and it is the thing that I have watched change. Christopher, from the time he was quite small, had a way of paying attention to people. Real attention, not the polite, surface attention that most people manage, but the deeper kind, the kind that notices when someone is not quite as they seem and decides to find out what is underneath. He would come home from school as a boy and I would ask how his day was and he would tell me about his day and then he would say, quite naturally, "But how was yours? How are you really?" That word. I noticed it the first time he used it. He was perhaps 8 years old, which seems young for the distinction between how are you and how are you really. But Christopher understood the distinction even then. He had learned it from watching me use it. I used it with Bob, with friends, with the neighbors who came for tea and sometimes had more on their face than their words carried. I would ask how are you and when the answer felt insufficient I would say, "But how are you really?" Christopher absorbed it. He started using it himself. He used it with me, with Elaine, with his friends, and later with the people in his life who needed someone to ask the better question. It became his particular quality. The person in the room who would ask the real question when everyone else was staying on the surface. I spent 40 years building a person around that quality. Not just that quality, but that was the center of it. Kindness, presence, the willingness to be genuinely in a room with whoever was in front of him, the willingness to drop what was convenient and be where he was needed. Bob and I were deliberate about this. We talked about it, not in any grand way. Not with a parenting philosophy written down or a list of values framed on the wall. But we talked about it in the ordinary way of 2 parents who care what kind of person their child is becoming and keep checking. We showed him things with our behavior. When Bob's colleague lost his wife unexpectedly, Bob went to see him every week for a year. He did not make a project of it or announce it. He simply went. Christopher saw this and he asked Bob why. Once. And Bob said, "Because Jim needs someone to go," and Christopher nodded and the lesson went in. The way the right lessons go in when they arrive at the right moment. When Christopher was 23 and starting his first proper job, I wrote him a letter. I do not usually write letters. I'm a talker, not a writer. But there was something I wanted to say to him that I knew I would say badly in speech, where I would get distracted or soften it too much or add qualifications that weakened the thing itself. So I wrote it, and in it I said, "The most important thing I hope you take from this family is not anything practical, not any skill or knowledge or connection. I hope you take the habit of asking the real question. The habit of noticing when someone in front of you is carrying something heavy and asking about the heavy thing, not the easy thing. That is the most important thing I know. I hope it lives in you. I gave it to him in an envelope. He read it in front of me. I had not expected him to read it in front of me. And when he finished, he looked up and his eyes were bright and he said, "I'll keep this," and he did. He told me, years later, that he had it in a box of things he kept. The things that mattered. I'm telling you all of this because I need you to understand what I'm talking about when I say she undid it. I am not talking about manners. I am not talking about whether he calls often enough or visits enough or sends the right flowers. I am talking about something central. About the quality at the heart of who he was and what I spent 40 years carefully tending. And I am going to tell you what happened to it in 2 years. Christopher met Diane 4 years ago. He was 39 and she was 36, and they met at a work conference, and by the following month they were together, and by the following year they were engaged, and by the year after that they were married. It moved quickly, the way things move when two people are certain. I liked Diane at the beginning. I want to say this honestly because it matters to the story. She was intelligent and self-possessed, and she had a warmth that was real, even if it was also somewhat managed. She was the kind of person who is aware of the impression they make and who tends that impression carefully, which is not the same as insincerity, but is not the same as openness either. She was kind to me. She said good things and meant them. She loved Christopher visibly and well. Bob liked her too. He said she was sharp. He said it the way he always said things he admired. Simply, without elaboration, as though the thing itself was complete and did not need building up. What I noticed, and I noticed it early, before the wedding, before any of what I am going to tell you, was that Diane had a way of measuring things. People, situations, opportunities. She measured them with an efficiency that was impressive and with a set of values that were, simply, different from ours. She measured by professional success, by income and address and the kind of holiday and the quality of the restaurant. Not cruelly. She was not cruel about these things, but consistently, automatically. The way you apply a measure you have always used without questioning whether the measure is the right one. She spoke about people in terms of what they did and what they had. She spoke about Christopher's old friends, the ones from before, the ones who had remained deliberately ordinary in a way of people who have decided that ordinary is what suits them, with a kind of mild, affectionate puzzlement, as though she could not quite understand why Christopher had been fond of them, what the common ground had been. She was not unkind about them, but she was not interested in them either. And Christopher. I watched this happen. Christopher began to speak about these friends the way Diane spoke about them, with a mild, affectionate puzzlement, with a small, barely perceptible distance that said, "These are people I used to know, rather than people I know." This was the first thing I noticed. He stopped calling Jim, Bob's colleague, the one Bob had visited every week for a year after his wife died. Jim was still alive, still in the same house, still the person Christopher had watched his father show up for. Christopher had always called Jim. Not often. A few times a year. Just to say hello. Just to ask, how are you really? He stopped calling Jim. I noticed. I said nothing. I told myself, people get busy. Marriages take time. New priorities reorganize the old ones. This is natural. But it was not only Jim. The Sunday calls began to change. Christopher had always called on Sundays. Not because I asked him to. I had never asked him to. It was simply what he did. He would call on Sunday afternoons, when the week was done and the new one had not yet begun, and we would talk for half an hour or 40 minutes about whatever was happening. He would ask about Bob. He would ask about Elaine. He would ask about the neighbors and the garden and the book I was reading. And at some point in the call he would say, "But how are you really?" The calls became less frequent in the first year of the marriage. I noticed but did not note it as significant. The first year of a marriage is demanding, reorganizing. In the second year they became rarer still. And then one Sunday, I remember this specific Sunday, November, gray and cold. I realized I had not heard from Christopher in 3 weeks. And I thought, he has not asked me how I am really in 3 weeks. And I tried to remember the last time he had asked it. I could not. The word had gone quiet. That small word. Really. The one I had taught him at 8 years old. That he had used for 35 years. That was in a letter in a box of things that mattered. Gone quiet. I told Bob. He said, "He's busy." Marian. I said, "He's busy in a way that wasn't there before," Bob said. "Marriages change people," I said. "Some changes are additions. Some are subtractions." Bob looked at me. He understood what I was saying. He did not argue with it. Let me give you the 2 years in their specific details. Because a change that is only described generally can always be explained away. The details are what make it real. The Christmas dinner. 14 months after the wedding. We had always had Christmas at our house. Not a rule. Simply what we did. What had grown over decades into the shape of our family's Christmas. Christopher brought Diane and we were all together and it was warm and imperfect in the way that good Christmases always are. Diane mentioned, during pudding, that her parents were in Spain for Christmas this year. She said it without particular feeling. They went to Spain regularly. It was simply their preference. Christopher said something I had not heard him say before. He said, "We might do that one year. Christmas somewhere warm. Get away from all the faff. Faff." The word sat in the room. I looked at the table. At the faff. The crackers and the paper hats and the Christmas pudding that Bob and I had made in October the way we always made it. Left to mature for weeks. Brought out for this specific evening. The fact that was 45 years of Christmas in one room. Bob said, mildly. Where's the fun in a beach at Christmas? Christopher said. I don't know. Might be nice to try something different. Diane smiled. Christopher smiled. The conversation moved on. I ate my Christmas pudding. The school friend. Christopher had a friend from school, Marcus, who had been his closest friend from the age of 11 through to their early 30s. When Marcus moved away and the friendship settled into the occasional visits and the dependable warmth of people who have known each other long enough that nothing is required to be explained. Marcus came to our house sometimes when he was in the area. He and Christopher had always had the ease of very old friends, the kind that picks up exactly where it left off regardless of the gap. 18 months after the wedding, Marcus came to visit. Christopher and Diane had dinner with him at a restaurant. I know this because Christopher told me afterward, in a call that was brief and informational rather than conversational. He said Marcus was the same as ever. He said it with a fondness that was real. And then he said, he's still at that same job, you know. Same flat. Hasn't really moved forward. Moved forward. I heard it clearly. The phrase. Its implications. That Marcus's choice of a life. Steady. Unchanged. Deficient. Was something to be understood as a failure to move. A failure to progress. A life measured and found wanting by the measure Diane had brought and Christopher had adopted. Marcus had been Christopher's friend for 32 years. He was a person Christopher had known more deeply and for longer than almost anyone. And he was now being assessed, measured, found to not have moved forward. I said, Is Marcus happy? Christopher said, I suppose so. He seems it. I said, Then he's moved forward in the way that matters. A pause. Christopher said, You sound like the old man. I said, Good. He laughed. The laugh was genuine and warm, and the Christopher I knew was in it completely. For a moment. And then the call ended and the moment went with it. The birthday. Bob's 70th. A significant birthday. The kind that warranted a gathering. And we planned one. Not extravagant, because we are not extravagant people, but a proper gathering. Family and friends and people who had known Bob for years. We set the date 3 months in advance. Christopher said he would come. 2 weeks before the birthday, he called to say that something had come up with work. The Henderson contract, or something like it. Something important and urgent and requiring his presence in a way that could not be rescheduled. He was sorry. He would do something special for Bob separately, just the two of them. He would take him to lunch. He took Bob to lunch 6 weeks after the birthday. It was a very good lunch, Bob told me. Christopher chose an excellent restaurant. He was warm and present throughout. He asked Bob about his health and his plans and the garden. He was, Bob said, completely himself. I said, Did he ask how you really were? Bob thought about it. He said, He asked how I was doing. I said, Not how you really were, Bob said. Marion, I said. And just noting, he said. I know you are. Patricia came to tea that week. Patricia has known our family for 25 years. She was Christopher's primary school teacher, of all things, and she became our friend in a way that sometimes happens when the professional relationship ends and what remains is the genuine kind. She had known Christopher at 7 and at 8 and at 9, when the attentiveness was first forming, when the really was first finding its way into his vocabulary. She asked about Christopher. I told her about the birthday. She said, How is he otherwise? I said. He's different, she said. How so? I said. He's lost something. The thing that made him. Him. The quality of real attention. He still functions well. He is professionally successful and personally organized, and he loves his wife and she loves him, and their life, by every visible measure, is a good one. Patricia said. But, I said. But he stopped asking the real question. And I don't think he knows it. She said. Do you think she changed him? Deliberately, I said. No. I don't think she knew what she was changing. She showed him a way to live that suited her values, and he adopted it, the way people adopt the values of the person they love. It is natural. It is human. It is not malicious. I paused. But it is still a loss, she said. Have you told him? I said. Not yet, she said. Marion. He might not know. I said. I know, she said. He might not know what he's lost if no one names it for him, I said. I know, she said. Then you are the person to name it, and then came the hospital. And I sat in that corridor for 4 days, and I thought about 40 years. And I thought about the Henderson contract. And I thought about the flowers. Not with anger. I want to be honest about this. In those 4 days I went through many things. Fear for Bob. Relief as the tests came back with their cautious reassurances. The particular exhaustion of a hospital vigil. The loneliness of being in a frightening place without the person you would normally call. But not anger at Christopher. What I felt about Christopher was more accurate than anger. It was grief. Because I sat in that corridor and I looked at my phone and I did not see a man who was unkind. I did not see a man who did not love me or did not love his father. I saw a man who had been taught to come, who had watched his father come for others his entire life, who had absorbed the lesson of presence at such a fundamental level that it was in his bones, and who had, in 2 years, overlaid that lesson with another one, the lesson that says, your time has value that can be calculated, that certain things are too important to interrupt, that flowers are an adequate substitute for presence if the presence is inconvenient. He had not been taught that lesson. He had been specifically, deliberately, carefully not taught that lesson. I had spent 40 years building a person who knew the difference between adequate and present, between the gesture and the arrival, between the flowers sent from a distance and the sitting in the chair. And he had unlearned it. That is what I kept coming back to. Not that he had failed to learn it. He had learned it. Thoroughly. It had been in him for 40 years. He had unlearned it in two. Elaine came on the second day. She drove an hour and a half without being asked. She appeared in the corridor with a sandwich that she pressed into my hand, and she sat beside me and she said, "How are you really?" I looked at my daughter. She said my word. Christopher's word. The word that had started with me and gone into both of them at 8 years old, and which Elaine still used and Christopher had let go. I said, "I am frightened and tired, and I miss your father even though he's 30 meters away." She said, "I know." She sat with me. She took a shift so I could sleep at the hotel across the road. She brought coffee in the mornings. She did all the things that needed doing without being told what was needed, because she knew what was needed, because she knew how to be present. I had spent 40 years teaching her the same thing, and it had stayed. On the third day, Christopher's flowers arrived. Elaine called to say they had been delivered. She said, "They're beautiful, Mum." "Really beautiful?" I said. "Yes." "He always chooses well," she said. "He didn't come," I said. No, a pause. She said, "I know," and in those 2 words I heard 38 years of a daughter who had been watching the same family from the same house and understood what I understood without me having to explain it. Bob came home on the 4th day. He was quieter than usual. Not from the illness, which the doctors were managing, but from the specific thoughtfulness that hospital stays produce in people who have time to lie still and think. He looked at the flowers when he came in. He said, "From Christopher?" I said. "Yes," he said. "That was kind," I said. "Yes." He looked at me. And then he said, "How long has it been since he just came?" "Marion?" "Without a reason," I said. "A while," he said. "Before Diane?" I said. "Yes." Before Diane. He sat down at the kitchen table. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said. "Talk to him," he said. "He's not going to like it," I said. "Probably not," he said. "Will it change anything?" I said. "I don't know. But I have spent 40 years being honest with him, and I am not going to stop now because the honesty is becoming convenient." Bob looked at me for a moment. He said, "He gets that from you," I said. "He used to." Oliver saved something for me before the conversation with Christopher. Oliver is 5 years old. He is Christopher and Diane's son, born 8 months after the wedding, a fact that arranged itself quickly and which everyone received with uncomplicated joy. He is a small, round, serious person with Christopher's eyes and Diane's precision and something else entirely. Something that is pure Oliver and which I am going to try to describe accurately because it matters. He notices people. At 5 years old, Oliver notices people. Not in the deliberate way of an adult who has been taught to look, but in the instinctive, prelinguistic way of a very young child who simply feels the room and responds to what is in it. When Bob came home from the hospital, thin and quieter than usual, Oliver was there. Christopher and Diane had brought him for a welcome home visit the Sunday after Bob was discharged. And Oliver walked into the house and he looked at his grandfather and he said, not to anyone in particular, just as an observation, Grandpa looks tired. He said it without agenda. As simple information. The room went quiet for a moment, and then Bob said, "Yes, my love. I am a little tired." Oliver went and stood beside Bob's chair. He did not climb up. He is a child who asks first, always, before climbing. He said, "Can I sit with you?" Bob said. "Please do." Oliver climbed up. He sat with Bob for 40 minutes while the adults had tea and talked. He did not fidget or demand entertainment or require anything. He simply sat beside a man who was tired, being present with a 5-year-old's complete unself-consciousness. I watched Christopher watching his son, and I saw something in Christopher's face that I had not seen in a long time. Something that was recognition. The recognition of a person who is watching someone do something he used to do and feeling, dimly and uncomfortably, the distance between who he is watching and who he currently is. Later, when Oliver was in the garden with Bob and the adults were inside, Christopher said, not to anyone in particular, "He's a good boy, isn't he?" Elaine said. "He's wonderful," Christopher said. "He sat with Dad for nearly an hour," I said. "Yes," Christopher said. "Just sat," I said. "Yes." He looked at his hands. He said something that I think surprised even him. He said, "I should have come." When Dad was in hospital, the room was quiet. I did not say anything immediately. I waited. Because the moment when someone says the right thing after a long time of not saying it is a delicate moment, and delicate moments need to be received rather than seized. Then I said, "Yes, you should have." He looked at me, and in his eyes, in those attentive, noticing eyes that were still his, still the ones I had watched notice things since he was 8 years old, I saw the person I had raised, present, uncomfortable, honest enough to be present and uncomfortable at the same time. He said, "I'm sorry, Mum." I said, "I know." He said, "I want to," I said. "Will you come tomorrow?" "On your own?" "Just to talk," he said. "Yes," I said. "Good." He came at 10 o'clock the next morning. Diane was working and Oliver was at nursery, and he came alone, the way I had asked. He sat at the kitchen table in the chair he had sat in at 10 years old and 20 years old and 30 years old. And I made the tea and I brought it to the table and I sat down across from him. He said, "You want to say things?" I said. "Yes," he said. "About not coming to the hospital," I said, "among other things." "Well, let me start somewhere else." He waited. I said, "When did you stop asking how people really were?" He looked at me. He did not pretend not to know what I meant. He knew the word and he knew the distinction and he knew what I was asking. I watched him know it. He said, "I don't know." I said, "I do. I've been watching for the last 2 years and I have noticed it's going. The way you notice when a sound stops that you had grown accustomed to. The room goes different." He said, "Mum," I said, "let me say it. Christopher." I am not going to say it angrily, but I am going to say it completely. because I have not been saying it for 2 years, and the not saying has not served either of us. He nodded. I said, "You changed. In 2 years. Not in the way that people change when they are growing, adding things, becoming more. In a way that people change when something is being replaced. The things I spent 40 years building in you. The attentiveness, the willingness to drop what was convenient and be where you were needed. The real question, the habit of presence. Those things have become quieter in you. And the things that have become louder are things I did not put there." He was very still. I said, "I am not blaming Diane. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Diane did not force anything from you. She showed you a way of living that suited her values, and you chose, freely, to adopt those values. That is a human thing to do. It is natural. It is what happens in marriages. But Christopher, the choosing is yours, not hers. And the losing is yours to account for." He said. "What have I lost?" I said. "The person you were. The person who called Jim even when there was no particular reason. Who made Sunday calls that had nothing to do with news. Who sat with Bob at the hospital because sitting with Bob at the hospital was simply what you did when you needed someone." He said. "I sent flowers." I said, "I know. They were beautiful flowers." He said, "You're going to tell me flowers aren't enough." I said, "I am going to tell you that flowers are what you send when you cannot come. But you could come. You chose not to." A long silence. He said, "The Henderson contract," I said. "Christopher," he stopped. I said, "Your father was in hospital. The Henderson contract will still be there when you have finished being a son." He looked at the table. He said, "I know." I said, "Do you?" He said, "Yes. I know. I knew it when I said it." He looked up. "I knew when I said it that it was wrong. That I was making a choice I should not make. And I made it anyway." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because it was easier. Because Diane is." He stopped. He started again. "Because I have been living in a different way for 2 years, and the different way has its own. It has its own current. It has its own logic. And it has become very easy to follow the current without noticing where it is taking you." I said, "I know." He said, "Oliver sat with Dad for 40 minutes yesterday." I said, "I know. I saw." He said, "I watched him and I thought, that's what I should be doing. That's what I used to do. And somewhere in the last 2 years I stopped." I said, "Yes." He said, "Mom, did I lose it? Completely?" I looked at my son, at 43 years old, sitting in a chair where he had sat at 10 and 20 and 30, asking me a question with the specific vulnerability of someone who is not sure of the answer and is afraid of it. I said, "No." Oliver proves it. He looked confused. I said, "Oliver is 5 years old and he notices people. He walks into a room and he feels it. He sat with your father without being asked. He said Grandpa looks tired when everyone else was pretending not to notice. I looked at him steadily. I did not teach Oliver that. You did. Whatever I put in you. Whatever I spent 40 years building. You passed it forward without knowing you were passing it. It is in your son. Christopher pressed his lips together. He looked at the table. He was quiet for a moment. That was doing real work inside him. I know the quality of his quiet. I have been watching it for 43 years. He said, "It's still in me too, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, it is still in you, but it is being used very quietly right now, and I need you to bring it back. Not for me. Not because your mother is asking you to, but because the person you were before the current took you as a behemoth and the current is making you." He said. "Diane," I said. "This is not about Diane. I have said that and I mean it. Diane is her own way of living, and it is not mine, and it is not yours from before. But it is hers, and she came by it honestly. You chose to adopt it. You can choose differently." I paused. "This is about you. About Christopher. About the 43-year-old man in this chair who knows exactly what I'm saying because I am using the same language I have been using since he was 8 years old." He said. "The real question," I said. "Yes," he said. I stopped asking it. I said. "You did," he said. "I'm going to start again," I said. "Are you?" he said. "Yes. Starting now." He looked at me directly. "Mom, how are you really?" The room was very quiet. I looked at my son, at the eyes that were still his eyes, still attentive, still noticing me, fully, the way he had always noticed me, the way Oliver noticed Bob the day before. Present. Here. Real. I said, "I am frightened that I am losing you. I am tired from 4 days in a hospital corridor. I miss your father even when he is in the next room. I am proud of your son beyond what I can easily say. And I am glad. Right now. I am glad you came this morning." He said. "I should come more," I said. "Yes, you should," he said. "I will," I said. "I know you will," he said. "Mum, the letter you wrote me when I was 23, I said. "I remember it," he said. "I still have it," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to read it again," I said. "Good. And then put it somewhere you'll see it. Not in a box, on the wall, or the fridge. Somewhere it can remind you." He looked at me. He said, "You think I need reminding?" I said. "I think everyone needs reminding. Even the people who were paying the most attention." He nodded. He drank his tea. He stayed for 2 hours. It has been 4 months since that morning in the kitchen. Christopher calls on Sundays again. Not every Sunday. I would not expect every Sunday. The world is busy, and he is a person with a life that makes genuine demands on his time. But most Sundays, He calls and we talk about things that matter and things that don't matter, and at some point in the call he says, "But how are you really?" The word is back. It came back quietly, in that first call after our morning together. He said it, and I heard it, and I did not make a thing of it. I simply answered it honestly, the way I always answered it. And in the answering, I think he remembered why it was worth asking. That the real question gets the real answer. That the real answer is where the real conversation lives. That the real conversation is what a relationship between two people actually is, underneath the news and the logistics and the catching up. He came for Bob's birthday, the one that had been missed. He organized a smaller celebration, just family, a proper dinner. He arrived an hour early and he sat with Bob in the garden while I cooked, and I could see them from the kitchen window. Two men, 43 and 71, sitting in the spring garden with their tea and their easy silence and their 32 years of being father and son. Oliver was between them, digging something in the flower bed with a spoon that had disappeared from the kitchen some time before and which I had decided not to pursue. I watched the three of them. Grandfather, son, grandson. The same quality in all three. That particular attentiveness. That noticing. The thing I had spent 40 years building in one of them, which he had passed forward to another, which had skipped the 2 difficult years as though it knew they were temporary. It had been temporary. I want to say that. What happened in those 2 years? The current that took him, the values that replaced his own, the flowers sent from a distance. It was not permanent. It was a detour, not a destination, and the path back was not impossible. It required honesty, and it required the honest person to be his mother rather than waiting for him to find it himself. But it was there. I want to say something to the mothers who are reading this, who are watching, who have spent years building something careful in a human being and who are now watching that human being become, in some ways, someone they did not build, who are noticing the absences, the small word gone quiet, the Sunday call that stopped, the habits of presence replaced by the habits of distance. Do not be silent about it. Not in anger. Anger will close the door. Not in accusation. Accusation will put him on the other side of it. But in honesty. In the same honesty you used when you were teaching him. In the same directness that you modeled every day for 40 years, hoping it would go in. It went in. Even when it looks like it didn't. Even when the current has taken him somewhere unfamiliar. It went in and it is still there, and the proof of it is often in the child. In whatever small person he is raising who looks at a tired grandfather and says, "Grandpa looks tired," and goes to sit beside him. You planted something. It does not disappear. It goes quiet sometimes. It gets overlaid. But it is there. And your job, a last, most important job, is to say, "I see what has gone quiet. I am going to name it, because I love you enough to name it, not to punish, not to shame, to name, to say, This is what you had and this is what has gone quiet, and I'm telling you because I believe you can bring it back, and I believe you want to, and I believe you are still the person I raised even though the current has been strong. He is still the person I raised. He sat in the kitchen yesterday morning. He comes on Tuesdays now, sometimes, for no particular reason, just to come. And he drank his tea and he told me about all of his new interests, which is birds, and which has apparently resulted in a level of intensity about garden birds that Bob considers a personal honor, since Oliver insists on conducting all bird observations from the chair beside Bob in a garden. He told me about the Henderson contract, which closed well, and about something funny that Diane had said at dinner the week before that had made him laugh for an hour. He told me about a work colleague who was going through something difficult and who Christopher had invited to lunch, just to have someone to talk to. He said, I remembered what he said about Jim, about showing up. I said, Did you? He said, I thought about Dad going every week. And I thought, I can do that. I can buy a man lunch. I said, Yes, you can. He drank his tea. He looked out at the garden where Bob and Oliver were engaged in some kind of bird-related project that involved a notebook and a great deal of pointing. He said, Mom, I said, Yes, he said, I want you to know that I know what those 2 years were, and what they cost. He said it carefully. Exactly. I'm not going to pretend the current wasn't real. It was real. I let it take me further than I should have. And I'm sorry. I said. I know, he said. Is sorry enough? I said. It is enough if the coming on Tuesdays continues, and the Sunday calls. And the real question, he said. All three, I said. Then yes. It is more than enough. He nodded. He looked back at the garden. Bob was writing something in the notebook, taking Oliver's dictation with the seriousness of a man who has understood that bird records required accuracy. Oliver was pointing at something in the hedge with the full authority of a 5-year-old expert. Christopher watched them. He said, How are you, Mom? Really? I looked at my son, at his eyes, which were his eyes again, noticing, present, asking the real question with the word in it that meant he wanted the real answer. I said, I am well. I am better than I have been in 2 years. I am watching my husband and my grandson conduct a scientific survey of garden birds, and I am drinking tea with my son who came for no particular reason, which is the best possible reason to come. He smiled. The full smile. The one that had been there at 10 and 20 and 30, and which the 2 years had not, it turned out, been able to take. I said, That is how I really am, he said. Good, and we drank our tea. And the garden went on. And the birds were recorded. And the morning did what Tuesday mornings do when the people in them have said what needed saying and can now simply be.